And John 1:14 is one of the texts that we're going to be looking at in this course. But I wanted to start there because what John is trying to do there is, in a measure, what I'm trying to do in this course, which is to look at the whole sweep of the biblical revelation. John is looking right back to Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning. He's looking right on to the moment when the Word became flesh and pitched his tent, tabernacled in our midst. And he's looking on towards the vision which we then have when we really understand who Jesus is, the ultimate vision of God and of God's purposes. That gives you the whole biblical narrative in a nutshell. Now, the Bible is clearly not just a collection, a ragbag of isolated sayings. When I started to study the Bible in my early teens, one of the ways I did it was by learning certain key verses, which were taken cheerfully out of context. I can still remember some of them. A verse here from Romans, a verse there from John, something from Isaiah, something from Genesis, something from Revelation. And I had no idea how the surrounding landscape worked. But it was enough to get me walking in, as it were. And I was reminded of this when my wife and I lived in London for 3 years, and I had known London in various ways, by getting off the train at this station, by going to a meeting at that building, or by occasionally going to a great service in a great church. But usually I travelled around London by tube, so I was going on the underground and then popping up at the place I needed to be, and I had no idea how it all fitted together. And when we lived in London, I took great delight in walking around and gradually realizing, oh, that's how you get along that bit. And then this street has these interesting things happening in it, and so on and so on. And that's the kind of exercise that I suppose I'm inviting you to with this course. Here are 15 texts which are key places that you will want to visit as you get to know this great city we call the Bible. And when you do that, you may then want to wander around in between and see how the connections work and live out some of those connections for yourself. Of course, there are passages in the Bible which are apparently just random sayings, like the book of Proverbs, although actually even Proverbs has its own underlying narrative line for those who are prepared to probe and look for it. But there are lots of passages, lots of verses, which could really come anywhere. But most of the Bible isn't like that. Most of the Bible, as we have it, tells a story. The ancient Israel scriptures, that is, the books from Genesis through to the end of Malachi in the versions that we now have, or the end of Chronicles as it is in the Hebrew Bible, that tells a story in search of an ending. And Jewish life from the time of Jesus onwards was actually still wondering about what that ending might be. Would it be the coming of a Messiah? Would it be the formation of a community that was living by the law? What would it look like? The early Christians, when they wrote the books they did, they were saying in almost every book, but in many different ways, this is what the ending actually looks like. And so they are looking back at the scriptures from Genesis to Chronicles, or Genesis to Malachi, if that's the way you organize it, and saying, this is where it was all going. That is making a particular claim. So the Christian Bible makes that claim that this is a coherent overall narrative from Genesis to Revelation. And whoever wrote the book we call Revelation, his name seems to be John, but that's a very common name in the early church and in the surrounding culture, was clearly aware that when you get to the end in Revelation 21 and 22, there is a sense of closure. He's saying this is where that project, starting with humans in the garden, this is where it was all going, to redeemed humans, renewed humans, in a garden which is now a city which is also a garden, where the presence of God is there, palpable with his people. That's how the whole narrative works, and when we look at these little bits, that's the story into which they belong.